The United States, 1857. Slavery, rebellion, and rumors of war. In 3 years, Americans would turn on each other and make history. But yet, in New York City in 1857, Americans were about to write a brand new revival history. The date was September 23rd. A Christian layman named Jeremiah Lanphier held his first businessmen's prayer meeting. That same week, meetings began in dozens of places around the nation. Only 6 men attended Jeremiah's first meeting. 2 weeks later, the stock market crashed. Thousands of families lost everything they had. This birthed one of the greatest spiritual awakenings the world has ever seen. Week by week, the tiny lunchtime prayer meetings grew larger and larger and larger. And by December, Jeremiah's 6 men had become 10,000 men. And they met not every week, but every day. The New York newspapers took notice, and when word spread to other cities, spontaneous revival broke out across the country. In Cleveland and in St. Louis, thousands of people packed downtown churches and theaters 3 times each day just to pray. In Chicago, churches had to have waiting lists for people wanting to teach Sunday school. And all across America, pastors were baptizing 20,000 new believers every week. Revival would hit over 50 nations around the world, changing how people lived their lives. And in England, entire towns were converted. Some towns disbanded their police force because of a lack of crime. So many people came to Christ, churches had to hold services outside just to accommodate the crowd. Truly, the world had never seen anything like this before. Godly men like Jeremiah let God create a global prayer revival. It changed the course of history. And now, people need to know, can history be repeated? Genesis 26:18 tells us Isaac dug again the wells of Abraham.
In every generation, there have been revivals, massive moves of the Spirit that changed the course of history. In every revival, there were believers like you who chose to answer the call, to become the one in their generation. Discover your call to be the one in your generation.
We're about to take you face to face with history. Welcome to Revival Radio TV. I'm your host, Pastor Gene Bailey, and I'm here again, Linda Lane. What's your name again? Doug Bonner and Pastor Greg Stevens. Thank you guys for being here. Pastor Greg, I want to start off today talking to you about a subject because you're a senior pastor of a church. And as a pastor, how important really is prayer in the church?
It's the power plant.
It's the power plant. Explain.
It's what drives the engine of the church. Because it's the prayer is not mumbo jumbo. It's it's communication with your Father.
That's right.
And if there's no communication in that body of believers with the Father, corporately or individually, how strong can you be?
Yeah.
It's true. And you said it exactly. It's communication with the Father, communication with heaven, whether it's for your own personal, I need healing, or direction, guidance. It's the pipeline.
Imagine if I had a loving relationship with my wife, and I do.
Yeah,
Didn't I
glad to
say
hear
if.
Quick.
But I never speak to her.
Oh, my word.
I never communicate with her. I never whisper sweet nothings in her ear, except for Sunday morning.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? If there's no, we go sing love songs on Sunday morning, but all week long we've been distant from one another. It's vital.
It's vital. So as we talk about prayer and revivals and stuff, you can't go far in your study in revivals until you hit the Great Prayer Revival of 1857. That's what we're talking about today.
Amazing.
Now, we've touched on this before, right, Linda?
We have.
You know, with Jeremy Lanphier and how he did, and, you know, when it started in New York. So let's kind of real quickly kind of recap that, because since we've done that program, we've discovered so much more that happened. So, but for those that missed that, tell us again what happened with Jeremy Lanphier, Great Prayer Revival.
Well, basically, on September 23,
1857, he started a noonday prayer revival in New York City.
Right.
And what was so amazing about it was it only had like 6 people that showed up. And he had been asked to do this prayer meeting. He'd gone through, he distributed brochures everywhere.
Yeah, and as I remember the story correctly, he actually distributed 20,000 brochures at his own expense, used up all the money, and had a whopping 6 people come.
Yes.
And he was not a preacher, he was a businessman.
Right.
Yeah.
But the next week he had 20, and for the next couple of weeks it just incrementally increased to the point that he had daily prayer meetings, and it was huge. I mean, he was having hundreds come in. But it didn't start with him. It went back before that. And he actually, you know, we all have a season of prep before God says, here, go for it. And even though he had, you know, such a small number on his first time, his season of prep was under Charles Finney's Boston Friday night meetings. It was under South Carolina, had John John Girardeau, and this was from South Carolina. This guy could have been a pastor anywhere. He had the ticket, he had the charm, he had the credits, he had
He doesn't
the anointing.
take a very good picture there. Yeah.
And the thing is that he chose to go to a church in South Carolina that had 48 church members. It was before the Civil War, and they were black slaves. But they were very special because as they were having their services and their prayer time, it started with the prayer for them.
Right.
The Spirit of God landed on him one night, and he said, this is it. We're here. This is our moment. So for the next 8 weeks, every night he had services, and it didn't matter your economic level, it didn't matter your gender. They showed up, 1,500 to 2,000 people a night. And of that, among those people was Jeremiah Lampier. And so it was really exciting to discover that gem. And then he went back, you know, into what was going to be his life in New York City, and he took revival with him.
So before you go any further with that, Doug, I know that I'm asking the Brit something about America.
This is not good.
But in that,
Yep.
and you mentioned something before we went on air about when I look back at Jeremy Lampier and what he did with his prayer meeting, it was from 12 o'clock to 1 o'clock every day.
Yeah.
What did he tell people that they had to do?
They had a rule, and you must not break this rule. It's the 5-minute rule, because they wanted to give as many people an opportunity to pray. So it was a poster. It was the 5-minute rule, and people were invited to come in the businessman's lunch hour. Now, his background was a businessman, and he realized all these people in New York, Fulton Street is where it is. Well, I mean, today, that street is in the shadow of the World Trade Center.
Right.
And so he would put out all these bills, and these businessmen started to show up. And something happened in the business world of, well, actually the whole world, actually, at that time. There was a big crash. It was akin to 2008 with no bailouts.
Right.
And so all these businessmen would just pile into these prayer meetings. They had 10,000 every day attending prayer meetings. One of the newspapers, they took a reporter and a buggy, and he rushed to as many of these as he could get to. He got to 12, and there was many, many more. He counted 6,000. So people, instead of turning to despair, were turning to God. It was called in some places a year of grace. In the financial world, it was a year of panic.
Right.
And the interesting thing was, it was not headed up by a big evangelist or a big name.
There was the no-name revival.
Yeah, I mean, there was one lady. She traveled from the west part of the country in those days on a train to Fulton Street, and she said this: it was a never-ending, continuous prayer meeting. She would come to one station and stop there. There's a prayer meeting on the train platform. On the train, people were praying everywhere.
Now, Greg, Pastor Greg,
1857.
now isn't that like what prayer's supposed to be?
Yeah, sure.
We've got open communication to God, like you talked about.
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah.
So, but now, interesting thing, Greg, in that is that, correct me if I'm wrong here, they couldn't. When we say prayer, we're going to have a prayer meeting or a prayer revival meeting. Typically, what happens nowadays is you get there and you go to the church or the meeting. Somebody gets up and preaches for an hour.
Yeah.
Right.
You know,
Right.
and then and then and if you're lucky at some point, I'm not lucky, but you know, if there's some point, somebody eventually prays, and that may be it. And we call it a prayer meeting. That's not a prayer meeting.
No,
But that wasn't the way it was there. Was
Back in the day, they used to just hang on and hold. Brother Hagin said it this way: praying till you get the release
Right.
in your spirit, and you pray the word, and you pray till you get that release. You know, the old timers did that. They you know, I call it hanging on to the horns
Horns
of
of
the
the
altar.
altar.
You know,
Right.
and
Yes.
And amazing things would happen. There's a great story here and prayer requests were put in envelopes and handed.
Right.
And they'd be opened. So a prayer request comes up and says, I'm a Christian, I'm praying for my unsaved husband, and please pray for him. But things would happen in these prayer meetings that you would not expect. So a man gets up, a big burly guy, and says, I think I'm that man, and please pray for me. He sits down, and someone else gets up and goes, no, I'm sure I'm that man. And about 5 or 6 people just got up. That was in a prayer meeting in Kalamazoo. And as a result of that, 600 people, got saved. Who would have heard such a thing? It's a prayer meeting, but people would come, and there's not much preaching in these at all.
Right.
It's just prayer.
Right.
And people actually, they preferred to go to a prayer meeting than to a preaching meeting.
True. Yeah. Well, in New York City, the businessmen gathered and they rented a theater. And in many of the prayer meetings, it was very male-oriented, but in this prayer meeting, they allowed any gender, any color to speak and participate. And so, because they were hoping that they'd actually get some of the streetwalkers and so on, get them into this and get them saved. And so, basically, in one of these meetings, a gentleman stands up, and he's a sea captain. And he said that his ship had been shipwrecked, and for 4 days he was lashed to his ship. And he said, finally, God, if you save me, I'll serve you. And so here he was giving testimony in the meeting. And he ended up saying, now it's my quest to pray that all my shipmates will also find Christ. And so later on, he's going out of the same harbor, new ship. And they're having these prayer meetings on the ship. 5 ships coming in have been hit with conviction. They entered that 10-mile perimeter of America, and they just got landed with conviction. And they have started up 5 ships he encountered that were holding daily prayer meetings as well.
And the newspapers just caught on to this, and that helped to spread really the revival. And they focused on Jeremiah Lanphier in Fulton Street, and so his name, that's why it always comes up. But it spread over, to Northern Ireland, to South Africa,
7
all different places.
Wait, before you get into that,
Yeah.
so because I know it went international.
Yeah.
But let's before we get into the international part. So, Greg, we've got people praying. We've got people every day, and what's happening. While we don't usually the words prayer and revival, you don't usually hear those together, because you usually kind of think, well, they pray and then revival comes.
Right.
But it really was a blending. There was revival. I'm telling you, when people stand up in the middle of a meeting and go, "Oh, that's me,"
It's amazing.
that's a revive. That's
I tell you.
a refreshing, a renewing.
Yep.
That something's going on. So we've got this whole thing happening, but there's the date. Why is it it's called September 23rd?
See, you guys were talking about it. I've been just sitting here quiet thinking about this because I'm going through the history timeline here. We're just past the gold rush of 1849.
Yeah.
And we're in 1857. It's just prior to the Civil War. President Buchanan
Yep.
is there. Buchanan is a bachelor, the only bachelor president we ever had, the 15th president of the United States. And he's an interesting guy, only guy from Pennsylvania. But his parents are Ulster Scots from Ulster, Ireland. And you just mentioned Ulster.
Huge revival there. Huge.
At the same time,
Yep.
all of these things you're telling me happened on 23rd.
Tasmania had a revival. Transylvania, which would undergo 5 nations and end up being in Hungary, being called Hungary. Ulster Revival. We had South Africa with the Zulus. We had, gosh, there was 8 different ones that we ended up having. Canada. I mean, we've got Laffy, who's
all across Canada.
yeah.
Okay, but on this date, I mean, there's history that says on that date things were happening.
Well,
Okay,
that's
I got it.
yeah.
1857 is the Gregorian calendar. That's our calendar. It's not God's calendar.
So what is it?
September Tishri 15. It's Sukkot.
Ah,
This is the Feast of Tabernacles.
We didn't expect to find this, and when we started running across diaries, and it said the South African revival happened on the exact day as the noonday prayer revival, then I started looking at all these other places I'd found, looking for that same thing to see if that existed, and we found it in 8 countries.
Okay, now I've got chili willies on me because the Feast of Tabernacles is one of the appointed feasts of God. He said, these are my feasts, my appointed times. And it's right after the Day of Atonement. Atonement was for the Jews
Right.
to atone for their sin for the year. Feast of Tabernacles is the atonement for the nations.
Oh, my word. That's great.
Wow.
When the
Yeah.
Jewish people would atone for the nations and bring them in, it's the wave offering. It's what we refer to as Palm Sunday sometime. And the reason they got so upset at Jesus is because it was happening at the wrong time. It's happening at Passover instead of tabernacle or booths or Sukkot.
Yep.
It's when they lived, they to this day they make a little booths for themselves. It's the atonement of the nations. It's the washing of the water. There's a water blessing that the priest would do.
Yes.
And Jesus stands up in Jerusalem at this time and he says, I'm this living water. If you drink of me, out of your belly will flow water, living water. And so now we got these revivals breaking out.
Yes.
Now I want to know why. I want to know if it's a Jubilee year or what. I got to look that
so
up.
quickly, you said 8 nations. So America, Canada, Ireland,
Tasmania, Transylvania.
which is basically Hungary.
Yeah.
okay, and
South Africa.
South Africa.
It's a whole
So
bunch.
there's actually records that go back and say on this date something happened.
Yeah.
Well, people are all excited because in 1857, they didn't know what was going on. In fact, even here in the United States, just before that, as a prep, New Orleans, I guess Jesse Duplantis would say Nolans, but basically in New Orleans and in Nashville, and there were several other towns that were considered southern towns, they had this revival that was happening as well. But it's like when the noonday prayer revival happened, and see the thing is it didn't just happen with Jeremiah. Down the street you had the YMCA that was setting up this, you had the businessmen that were renting this theater. Everybody there was this spirit of prayer and this desire for this meeting that just came out of nowhere. And you had obviously Finney that was prepping. You had the South Carolina revival that something happened. But it was just like, it was like the Spirit of God just moved over the earth and this just happened. And
So what happened in South Africa?
well, there was, in 1856, there were a bunch of people who were prophets. And they were tribal connected. And so it wasn't like what we think of as prophets where it's godly. They were ungodly. They were giving out prophecies that were intended to harm the people. And so this one 16-year-old girl, she tells this long prophecy about, oh, the sun's going to turn this color. And if you kill your animals, if you destroy your grain, the British who were occupying that area will be driven to the sea. So they do it. Sorry, Doug. They do it. And the
That's
problem
amazing.
is they starved.
Yeah.
And it was horrid. They started eating each other. Some of the people ran to the missionaries in that area, to the missions, ran to basically, the government said, eventually we'll get around to being able to, how government moves slower.
Sure.
Well, when it came to the missionaries, they gave them food, they gave them a new start in life, but they also gave them Jesus. And the revival was huge. It broke the tribal structure in that area.
And you have to almost sometimes go to that region to understand how strong the tribal structure, how deep that goes, because that is, for that to be broken, that is huge. I mean, it really, really is huge. What was going on over in your neck of the woods?
Well, I was there just a couple of months ago in Northern Ireland.
I thought you meant you were there in 1857.
1857, that's right, through my little time walk there.
Yeah.
And I mean, even today, it's an enclave of evangelical Christians. That's 150 years on. But it began, I mean, there were people who were praying, but it broke out through exactly what you've been saying. It was that one person. And that one person was a young man called James McQuilkin. And he got saved through one person who was a missionary from England who'd gone to Northern Ireland and had left back Mrs. Colesville, I believe, a failure. And she only won one person to the Lord. That one person was a strict Calvinist who thought he was born saved, and she convinced him he needed a relationship with God. He led 3 of his other friends to the Lord. And these 4 people were a bit bored. They hadn't got anything to do. So a pastor says, you know, guys, do something. Please do something. So they said, we'll get the old schoolhouse, and we'll just get people in to pray and read the Bible. And so they just started, and more people came. And then all of a sudden, there's hundreds of people. And then the old schoolhouse in Kells is not big enough, so they move it to another place.
Yes.
But it was happening a lot through the youth and even the children. Now, when it got real big, all the big churches and evangelical auditoriums were filled with people who were praying and preaching. But it's so interesting that they recognized that God would use the children.
Right.
And a great story there's a man called Henry Montgomery. Now, he wrote a book called The Children of 59, and he tells his story. Amazing. I mean, just think about it. He's a 12-year-old boy, and his daddy just takes him around all these revival centers and these churches. It was 6 o'clock in the morning, not in the evening. He's at a prayer meeting, and there's great quiet and hush there. And this 13-year-old boy is led up to the pulpit. He's got no shoes on his feet, and young Henry, he is just transformed because this boy gives an impassioned plea for people to give their lives to God. And there were prayer meetings that would happen amongst the children.
Right. You were showing me a picture in this book.
Oh, tremendous. Absolutely outstanding of all the children. Of course, I've lost my place here now. Of all the children, here we go. Just a great story there of, okay, here's a wonderful illustration. A young boy, he's told to remain at home because the family are going, to a prayer meeting. And so, his mom gets back in the evening and she says, little Johnny, how was your day? Thinking, well, I played in the mud. He didn't say that. He said, I had a fine day. Some friends came over and we had a prayer meeting on the side of the road. He's 8 years old.
Wow.
And then there's a pastor. He finds out that 30 of these 8 and 9-year-olds have been meeting for like 3 or 4 days now for prayer. And they would pray for their unsaved friends. And the church elders were not afraid, to pluck these young ones up and put them in the pulpit.
Interesting. And that's huge. Again, that they were not afraid to put a child in the pulpit.
Mm-mm.
True.
Wow, especially there.
The other thing that we saw with revivals, like with Ulster, is it came in and there was this wave of the Spirit of God that did some, touch the hearts of the people. And then there would be a second wave that would come through. They sent Dr. William Gibson and Reverend William McClure to check out the American revival. And when they came back, that's when the revival just exploded. France had the same thing, where they basically had the revival that started 1857 at the time period. It went through the elite of Paris, and it was instrumental in what brought Paris and all the leadership there into their first ever democratic election, from being a royal king, or limited king, leadership. They sent someone to, Reverend Monod, to America, and he takes it back, and they have revival that goes all the way through, literally an awakening in France. And
now, doesn't any of that sound familiar with Azusa Street, how they were doing that?
Yeah.
Remember how they came into Azusa and
He's
then
the same
back?
yesterday, today,
Forever.
and forever.
Yeah.
And the Lord God changed not.
Yeah.
And you know what? These guys, that we've spoken about before were influential in their writings. And this gentleman here, you know, his writings, he had the orphanages in the 1800s, and so, you know, people would get these and get hungry and get praying, and wonderful things, you know, just started to happen.
This was a Scottish evangelist, Robert Haldane, and he wasn't involved in the UK side of things, and he went to Geneva, Switzerland, just to a town there, you know, a little school where there were 25 people learning about God, and they had a desire to do something for God. So he found out that 16 of them were not saved. So he began holding weekly meetings in his home to talk to these guys about the Lord, and 16 of them accepted Christ. Four of those guys, and they created a network that would go on to become called La Revel. And there was a German version, and there was a Swiss version, and it would give Germany 30 years of revival, and it would impact France so hugely. But basically, one guy, he wasn't even in those places for very long.
Yeah.
Just a few months out of his whole life, and it transformed in those nations.
I mean, all over, it's this. It's not just one person, it's one person, and then one person, and then one person, and then one person.
Yeah.
So everyone could be that one person. It's
That's
exactly what you've been saying, Gene.
Yeah, the ability. So what do you think, Pastor Greg, with this prayer revival, what did America get from this? Listen, you mentioned it earlier, we're on the heels of the Civil War.
We're on the beginning of the Civil War. This is just prior to.
Right.
We've had 1,415 banks go belly up.
And see, that's what's an interesting thing, because if you read Buchanan was very much against us having financial reserves in America. I mean,
Why was he against
I don't
it?
know.
He just didn't think
It's
it
a
was
crazy thing, isn't it?
I mean, beginning of the year of...
You may have had a quote on
Yeah,
that.
oh yeah. I mean, beginning of the year of that great revival was the year of the financial...
And we've got gold from the gold rush.
Yeah. So he said in his inaugural address that he was embarrassed by having too much of a surplus, and yet 9 months after that, it's all gone.
I can't prove this. I'm just going from my gut here, Pastor Gene.
Yeah.
I think it got us Abraham Lincoln.
You know, every week we come here, guys, and we talk about revival history. And listen, the reports come in really from all over the globe. People that watch us every week that are so interested in what God's doing, not just through history, but doing now in revivals. We've had pastors come up and talk about, hey, thanks for doing our research for us. You know, we're preaching it.
That's right.
Listen, I just want to tell you, thank you all for supporting the Believer's Voice of Victory Network. Because of what you do, it allows us to bring this program to you every week. And I just want to say thank you. Keep your support coming. And we'll see you next time right here on Revival Radio TV.